I know you've got an ear out for the start of the podcast, but before we jump into today's episode, I wanted to remind you to keep an eye out for Darryl Lee's limited edition Christmas treats, because they're in stores now. Like the iconic Christmas nougat pudding, so yummy and a gorgeous little gift. And some delicious Chrissy-themed twists on your favourite treats, like the Darryl Lee Rockley Road with chewy red and green jelly pieces, green and red crunchy milk chocolate balls, my favourites, and green apple and strawberry flavoured licorice. Watch them disappear. Your Christmas treats table will pop with colour and scrumptiousness. Spread some joy, bring the fun, and enjoy the Christmas tradition that is Darryl Lee. Hurry before they sell out. Darryl Lee makes Christmas better.
Looking for a new career? Welcome to Do HVAC Training Service Center in North Charleston. Enroll today in our comprehensive HVAC training hands-on field experience-based program, covering troubleshooting, maintenance, installation, and more on various HVAC systems and ductwork. We offer EPA and NAEC preparation and testing, along with various certifications. Enjoy payment options. Achieve certification in under 5 months. Enroll now for your new journey of skill development and career advancement. Log on to dewhvactrainingsc.com to inquire.
This is The 5 of My Life with me, Nigel Marsh. The series where I talk to notable people about 5 of their defining things. The way it works is my guests always choose a favourite film, book, song, place and possession. They tell me their choices in advance so I can research them, but they don't tell me why they've chosen them. That's the subject of our conversation. The reason I devised this series is I wanted to create a slightly different way to gain an insight into the real lives and thoughts of prominent people. Andrew Penfold is the CEO of AIEF, the Australian Indigenous Education Foundation, an organisation he founded in 2008 in a bid to help close the gap. AIEF carries out truly nation-changing work, supporting over 1,000 Indigenous people from over 400 communities in every state and territory of Australia. The results are among the very best in the world, with over 90% of AIEF students completing Year 12 and successfully transitioning into further studies or employment. Andrew, welcome to 5 of My Life.
Thank you, Nigel. Great to be here.
Before we get into your 5 choices, I would like to ask you a question about some of our other guests.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're not allowed to reveal favourites, obviously, but I'd like to ask you if any particular guest or story has stood out for you.
I think probably 2 of them have mostly, and they're both people I kind of know well or know, a little bit. Chris Mitchell and Tanya Plibersek.
Right.
I think in Chris's case, he was the most powerful man in the Australian media, and yet there's very little written about him, very little he's written or spoken about himself, and there's a lot of perceptions about a person like him with the whole Murdoch press thing and all of this sort of thing. But actually, when you hear him speak and have a chat with him, you find out that he's really quite a gentle person. He's very thoughtful. He's not sort of some right-wing zealot and all of this sort of thing. He's a very balanced, measured person. And to hear his story about his mum and his family and his experiences growing up and the experiences through the media and so on, it's just a fascinating individual. And I love kind of observing power. And when you see it in someone like that over such a long time, and then you see the human side of a person like that, it's really fascinating. And I've been fortunate to have built a friendship with him as well, which is wonderful. But just hearing him speak in that way was really insightful and interesting for me. And Tanya, I just think, she just her story, her family, her background, her experiences growing up in Sydney and, the national parks and the rock bands that she used to love and all of this sort of thing. And she's just a fascinating character. And I think she's someone who really appeals to people on both sides of politics. It's really hard not to like Tanya Plibersek, no matter how political you are, no matter what your political stripes. And to hear her speak in such a personal and humble kind of way about her background and her life story, I found her really fascinating as well.
I'm so glad that you chose those 2. Tanya brought in, I didn't ask her to, she brought in her 5.
Yeah, I know.
It's so sweet. And it's a very perceptive observation. just impossible not to warm to her.
Yeah.
Yeah, you think, I just like you as a human.
And when there's a really difficult debate, she doesn't kind of get rancorous and angry and bitter and hostile. She kind of, she's just a very good communicator, and she just builds, she builds followers basically from the way she acts, talks, engages, just very respectful and empathetic and personal and human, just an awesome person.
Kicking off with your film, you have chosen the Keanu Reeves, Patrick Swayze action thriller, Point Break. 1991. Mate, I'm imagining and I'm hoping there's something other than you like surfing behind this choice. Tell me about it.
Well, I think a lot of my choices don't come down to the content of the thing itself. It's really about the memories of it.
You understand the format?
Well, I guess so. But no, I mean, when I seriously think about what movie means the most to me, what film means the most to me, this takes me back to a whole different life and a whole circle of friends. And 1991, I was living in London, formed an amazing relationship with this guy that I met in a pub on a Thursday night or a Tuesday night, and invited him to come with us on a weekend to St. Patrick's Day in Dublin the following weekend. And he wasn't able to come because he had a wedding to go through on the Saturday, but he then got on a plane, left the wedding and came to St. Patrick's Day and spent the rest of the weekend with us in Dublin. A couple of years later, he became my best man, and when I got married, and just this instant friendship with someone. And basically there was him and another guy that he met, and my wife, Michelle, girlfriend at the time, and the four of us were just this little gang in London. And London was such an amazing part of my life, going over working these massive big law firms.
Where were you living, by the way?
I was living in Fulham,
right.
Southwest London, yep. Just around the corner from Earls Court, where all the Aussies kind of congregate. I think Fulham was the kind of Earls Court was the Darlinghurst and Fulham was the Paddington kind of thing. It was a little bit yuppie, but a great place to live with everything around it. And it was just an amazing time in my life. And as you know, certainly back then, I don't know what it's like these days, but pubs close early. You used to have the Sunday lockout where you had to, leave the pub and the pub would close for the afternoon and so on. And so every time we'd go out, we'd always come back to our place, this gang of four, and we'd play music and we'd have a few drinks and we'd just muck around, the four of us, largely the four of us. And we must have watched that movie 50, 60 times. And it was just the most ridiculous movie. I mean, I almost chose Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure for the same reason, right? They were our two sort of staples. And so for me, it's not, there's some funny lines. I do love surfing. Yeah. I thought, Keanu was a fantastic actor. Not necessarily that was his best movie, but, an interesting individual. And it just grew on me. And even as a result of that, we, there's this famous scene in it where Keanu jumps out of a plane without a parachute on. After watching that, we all had this fun experience where the four of us, plus a couple of others we managed to drag along, went and did this weekend up in Kent where you learn to jump out of a plane and do a parachuting. But we got there on the Friday night, and as often happens, Friday night, everyone goes a little bit too hard. And we turned up on the Saturday. We were staying in the local pub. And, of course, because we were staying there, they kept the bar open after closing hours. And we got to the training the next day after. Sorry, this was the Sunday. We'd done our training on the Saturday, turned up on the Sunday morning to do our jump. And the instructor said to us, just before we do anything, has anyone been drinking? And we were like, well, we had a couple last night. And it was like, none of you are allowed to jump. So we'd spent all this time, and then we had to wait months to get everyone available, the right weather, no wind, and all of this sort of stuff to do it. But we eventually did it. And, they take a little photo off a camera that they mount on the wing as you jump out. And this is not tandem with an instructor. No. You are sitting in the door of a plane and you have to push yourself out. And it's just incredibly scary. And so that for me was a kind of an interesting moment in life of doing that as well, and an experience and adventure. I would never do it again because I don't want to sort of risk my life. But, that came from the film, or having a few beers one night and let's go and jump out of a plane. Like, what a stupid thing to do. But the photo that was taken off the wing, Stu looked at it and he actually got it printed on a T-shirt and gave it to me. And he said, that is the ultimate definition of fear, looking at your face. And he was right, but amazing experience. But just the whole thing of London, I mean, a great city, a great time of life, a great age.
And what were you doing there?
So basically when I finished uni, my girlfriend, now wife, Michelle, and I went travelling all around the world, and we spent a couple of years backpacking literally, every corner of the earth and as most young Aussies did in those days and probably still do today, and eventually went to London to get a job and to live in London. It was part of the Aussie kind of coming of age.
What was the job? What was your profession?
Well, it was interesting because I'd qualified, I'd studied law, I'd done the 6-month College of Law, qualified as a solicitor in Australia, and whilst I was doing that, I worked for 2 years in a really big city firm in Sydney, big in, finance firm and so on. And anyway, so I got to London thinking I'd waltz into a job in a fancy city law firm. And of course, this was just at the end of 1990 and the recession where interest rates were at 20%. So every single firm in London was firing lawyers left, right and centre by the hundreds. And here's me sending out my resume, trying to get a job. I mean, in those days, no mobile phone. I was working as a bartender, making like £3 an hour through an agency. And I had to pay all my money to typists to write cover letters and resumes for me, send them off in the mail to law firms all over the place. And I didn't have a home phone because I was staying on people's sofas and stuff. So I had to actually give the phone number of a phone box, right? And so on my days off, I would sit in this phone box in the ground floor of the Law Society in Chancery Lane and give them the phone number and sit by the phone all day waiting for the call. Yeah. Of course, no one ever called me, Yeah. Anyway, eventually one firm, Freshfields, called me and said, there's no way we can hire you as a lawyer, but because we're firing people left, right and centre, but we do have an opening for a paralegal. It's better than being a bartender making £3 an hour. Would you like to take it? So I was over the moon, and I basically said to them, look, that would be fantastic as long as that doesn't preclude you on a policy basis from transferring me to become a lawyer. And they said, we'll give you 6 months and then see how you go. And as it actually happened, they promoted me to become a lawyer in about 4 weeks. So that was awesome. So, I worked in Freshfields doing big city finance firm. We were the lawyers to the Bank of England and represented all these massive companies. And I pretty much spent the 2 years there doing financing for aircraft fleets, major sort of facilities, billions of dollars, hundreds of banks and a bigger Irish airline aircraft leasing company. And just amazing experience. And, then once I was not earning £3 an hour and living on someone's sofa, we were sort of trotting off to Paris for the weekend and down to Amsterdam. And I worked with a whole lot of guys in London office who were, from all over the world, every nationality. So we had this real gang there. And but, the weekends, work always has been for me. Work is kind of work and friends are friends, and I never sort of like to cross over the two. So I did have some great friendships with the work colleagues and weekends and so on, but really the core of that, 4 of us as this kind of gang, which was the sort of the back to the Point Break kind of thing, where it all started, and it was just all the great times we had. And unfortunately, Stu, the guy who I was talking about, who then became our best man 2 years after we were married, he was actually killed in Melbourne. So we were down there for a Bledisloe Cup game. We'd flown down from Hong Kong when I was living at the time. And, we all went out afterwards for a few beers, and I went home a little bit earlier, and Michelle, my wife, and Stu and a couple of others left this bar and crossed a road, major road. And basically there was a taxi coming up on the inside that they didn't see. And Stu and my wife were holding hands as they crossed the road, and they both got hit by this taxi and thrown 50 metres up the road. Unfortunately, Stu, landed directly on his head and was killed instantly. And Michelle kind of woke up in a daze next to him, and, he was gone. So, there's the that sort of tragic element of it as well, And I guess, the movie reminds me of Stu, and Stu just kind of reminds me about a lot of things in life that I value and are important and so on. And I think the funny thing is that until that time, all of my best friends had come from people that I'd grown up with through boarding school or, other real sort of long-term interactions. And here's a guy I met in one night in a pub, and he turned up in Dublin the following weekend to come and join us for a party. And 2 years later was my best man. Actually, he was Michelle's best man. So Michelle and I decided we'd both have a best man and we'd both have a bridesmaid. So, Doyle was my best man, Stu was Michelle's best man, and then we both had bridesmaids as well. And Stu used to have this, he was just this guy who was so happy and so full of life and so adventurous. He had so many friends and adventures and everything. And we became best friends really quickly, but not just me, it was Michelle and I as well. It was a real kind of mutual friendship for both of us. But he used to say, who's this bloody Larry guy? happy as Larry. He goes, forget Larry, I'm happy as Stu.
Happy as Stu.
So now kind of we've got this in our sort of lexicon as well, where whenever we're happy and feeling great, we're happy as Stu. And it's just all that sort of memories of him and time in London, and and also remembering the tragedy and just that kind of idea of living life to the full and taking every opportunity and building friendships and connections with people, because you just never know,
It hangs on a thread, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Moving to your book, Andrew, you have chosen, I think, the most unusual and unique book on 5 of my life. It is just the most incredible tome. It's called Atlas of the Heavens, 1948, by Antonin Bekvar. Have I pronounced that right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. I won't describe it. I'd like you to describe it for us, please.
Well, I mean, it's it could equally be my favourite thing as my favourite book. It's kind of it was described, I think, by Nicholas Rothwell, who introduced me to it, or it was either Nicholas or someone else who he quoted. But basically, it's as much a work of art as a work of science. It's basically, here's this guy in the 1940s in Czechoslovakia, living in virtual isolation on the top of a mountain, in doing his astronomy and mapping the sky. So he basically developed an atlas of stars by hand, right? And it's just kind of, so the book itself, you turn the pages and you see these majestic works of art, and you just mind boggles. How could one person do this? It's so intricate and beautiful and detailed, and I know nothing about stars, but when I look at the pages of this book, it just makes me dream, and it makes me feel dreamy and lofty and taking away to an amazing place. And so, not only that, but he, this guy put his life on the line, basically. So, at the end of the war, when the German demolition squads were retreating and they went around smashing up everything in their way, he put his life on the line guarding this kind of observatory on the top of this mountain where he lived in isolation, and stayed a few more years afterwards to finish his work. And just, someone, I guess, there's so many things about this book. It's the beauty of it. It's the mind-boggling complexity of it. It's like you touch the pages, you look at the jagged edges on the cover, and it's a big A3 size book. Not many books are that bound. It was very hard to find. I actually read about it. So Nicholas Rothwell had written a book, and he started talking about it in there. And I was so fascinated by the way Nicholas kind of wrote about it and described it that I had to get it. And also because it was Czechoslovakia. My wife is Czechoslovakian. Her family were refugees from Czechoslovakia, and they're part of the underground movement, fighting the communists, and they had to flee the border and, getting chased by Germans with machine guns and hand grenades. So it's a real kind of thing. And I'd spent time in Czechoslovakia with my wife and her mother and grandmother, the 3 generations of the girls and me sort of tagging along, and fell in love with the place and just the beauty and imagery of this guy back then with no technology and, in the midst of war and chaos, sitting there calmly for years and years and years, creating an atlas of the heavens. It was just, I just had never heard of it. I didn't know it existed.
And the incredible thing, I mean, it's just a wonderful work of art, I agree, is it was used then as the standard. If for people to, understand where stars were or moons were, they would refer back to dear old Antonin's book.
Yeah.
It's just incredible. But I need to, I hate the word pivot, but I'm going to need to pivot slightly, because that guy dedicated his life to doing something that was meaningful and future generations could use. Mm-hmm. And sparing your blushes, that's how I view you with your work with AIEF. So you had a life change, and you have dedicated the last, if I'm correct, 12 or so years to building an amazing organisation and support network in AIEF. And I'd love you to talk a little bit to that.
Yeah, well, it's close to 20 years really since I started doing that work in 2004. 5 years just as a volunteer, setting up some Indigenous scholarship program at one school, and then AIF created in 2008, so 12 years ago. And yeah, look, I mean, basically, as you know, what we do is we provide scholarships for Indigenous kids to be able to go to fantastic schools of their choice. And then we help them get careers after they finish. And we've had fantastic success with the results that that's achieved in terms of those kids finishing school and moving into university employment and becoming leaders and role models and just really inspiring people. And, we've now got 1,000 kids that we've supported, over 1,000. And every day I feel completely blessed to be so inspired by their stories. Every day there's another story, and it's just incredible. And I guess in a way it sort of came out of tragedy, a little bit like the sort of the Stu thing where, my dad had died when I was very young, and I was raised by a single mum, and we're living in Glebe, which was kind of, now very trendy little cafe town. Back then it was the complete opposite. Mum was working long hours trying to make a living and support my sister and I, and doing her very best to do so. But, she was working in bars and restaurants and in catering and hospitality and so on. So it was very long hours, nights, weekends and so on. And so I kind of just grew up with a lot of freedom and sort of started disconnecting from school and getting in a lot of trouble and being a bad influence. And, a lot of schools kind of encouraged me to move on a couple of times. And I eventually found myself sort of sent off to boarding school, which I have to say, compared to boarding schools of today with their a la carte, vegan menus and low carbs and all of this sort of stuff, back then, they were more like a sort of a boys' home, not literally. It was a great experience, but they were brutal places. And so here was I, sort of 14-year-old, where I'd had, these years from 11, 12, 13, complete freedom, running around the streets of Glebe, playing with my mates and having a great time, then hanging out in pinball halls and wagging school and all of this stuff. And my marks were terrible at school. And my mum and grandmother intervened and somehow convinced this boarding school to take me in. And I hated it, absolutely hated it. It was like being sent to prison. So, in the first 6 or 12 months there, I was literally in detentions every weekend. I was in fights every second day. I ran away countless times. I'd spend a week in a youth refuge out at Bankstown where no one knew where I was. And I was on the cusp of expulsion the whole time. And, of course, in class, my grades were terrible. I think the highest result I got in any subject that year 9 was about 32%
Woo-hoo!
and so on. And then anyway, from then, it kind of these environments just morph on you. I'd never decided, okay, I'm going to try hard and knuckle down now, but just over the next few years, it just was a big transition for me. And I guess, that experience of the opportunity I had, I spoke about the time I had in London and working as a lawyer. I mean, I went from the shit kid in the bottom of the class in year 9 to becoming a lawyer and working in spectacular commercial international law firms and banks and so on, doing amazing things. And it was that educational experience and the environment and everything that I was in that really kind of changed my life. And so I'm certainly not saying for a minute that boarding school is for everybody or anything like that, but the combination of the great quality education, the camaraderie and sense of belonging that you build in a boarding school environment, the relationships you build, the after-school programs, the support in the homework centres, the whole package just becomes a really kind of compelling kind of thing for some people, even people like me who didn't want it, but yet it still managed to sort of shape and morph me. And so, and I guess the other part of that growing up in Glebe was, I had a pretty lefty kind of socially active family. And we were involved in marches and demonstrations and town hall meetings. And, I was getting dragged along to these things all my life as a kid, and I had lots of relatives who were politicians in the Labor Party and stuff. And so I was kind of growing up in this environment where we were very aware of social issues and what was going on and very involved. And so this issue of Aboriginal, their opportunities versus the opportunities someone like me had living next door or around the same street just because of virtue of skin colour and that sort of thing. So it was always an issue that I was really close to. And I think it really then came to a head where I was living in Hong Kong working in a bank at the time, and in 2002 when we had the Bali bombings. And I lost 12 of my mates in the Bali bombings who were down there on a rugby tour. My rugby team was down there. I was playing for the Hong Kong Football Club. And after that, a lot of us actually got together and set up a fund and raised a lot of money to help the wives of our friends who had died, their children, their families. And we also sent a lot of money to Indonesia to support Indonesian kids who lost a parent as well. And shortly after that, I was down in Sydney and someone told me that Joey's, the boarding school I went to, had started enrolling Aboriginal kids. And I was just fascinated by that. And I went to see them and they basically explained, I guess at the end of it, my question was, you've got 1,000 kids in this school, but you've only got 6 Aboriginal kids. Like, it's awesome what you're doing, but, you could probably do a lot more.
Yeah.
And basically their answer was, yeah, but money, it's obviously an expensive thing to do. So I went back to Hong Kong and started putting some ideas together, went back and presented to them to say, look, if you could raise $5 to $7 million, you could build an endowment fund and then you could have 30 or 40 Aboriginal boys here forever, every year. And they said, that's great, but how? And I said, oh, well, I can help and so on and so, because I just done this Bali thing. And I guess I realised that from the Bali thing, the experiences and skills I developed in law and business and finance and banking and so on could be used for another thing. And so I kind of just volunteered and sort of, announced to Michelle, hey, how about we move back to Australia and quit our jobs and just go and do this. So we spent the next 5 years from the dining room running that, raising the money. And at the end of that, which was when AIF started, there was a lot of the people who supported us saying, this is fantastic, but it's always been about more than one school. This is about showing what can be done, creating a template, a lighthouse project, whatever you want to call it. And then so a lot of our donors and supporters are really keen on seeing it go beyond that one school. And at the same time, we had dozens of schools from around Australia contacting us saying, how did you do that? And how did you raise the money? And can you help us? And we don't have anyone. Or, girls' schools who would say, oh, no one gives money to girls' schools. It's always the dads who give it to boys' schools and all this sort of thing. And so I kind of just gradually started helping. And then this idea took shape. Why don't we take it to the next level? Because I already had the sort of the core of the stakeholders and donors and stuff in place, because even though it was for one school, we never went to the old boy community. We went outside the school to do that. So it was a real community kind of thing. And, none of them I knew from being a banker or lawyer. These are all people I just knocked on doors and got to know. And so it grew from there.
Right.
So, now we kind of support about 400 kids a year at schools all around Australia. And we have about 600 or more than 600 alumni now who are all off exploring wonderful careers and living enriching and rewarding and great inspirational lives.
Yeah, for me, I mean, well, my views on this. I just think it's the most inspirational organisation and it's nation-changing. Before I fall off this perch, there will be thousands of men and women who've gone through an AIF scholarship, and that's going to change Australia for the better.
And look, we already bump into them everywhere we go. They work in government organisations, they work in companies and corporates, they work in schools as teachers, they work as plumbers and diesel mechanics and, service organisations, health organisations, 400 communities from around Australia. They're everywhere already. And they're such a potent force. This, because it's not just them individually. They go back to their communities and they've got siblings and cousins and friends and, the mob that they kind of have in these in Aboriginal culture. They're so connected to people and others see them as amazing role models, and doesn't mean they all want to go off to boarding school in the city or anything like that, and nor should they. That's not the idea. It's not about promoting boarding schools as some sort of magic solution, but they see the value of education and they see what you can do with your life and they see a brighter future for themselves. They want to be like their cousin or their brother. And so they all kind of get motivated. And I've seen that happen in so many families already, whether they're part of our program or not. You change the nation one person at a time. Hopefully you can scale it and do it on a larger scale. But as I think you said to me sometime, it's not the solution, but it's part of the solution. And it's one thing that absolutely works, and we've got the evidence to prove it.
We're going to go to your song, and you're keeping the unusual theme going, Penfold, because you've chosen the first song off Midnight Oil's debut eponymous album, Midnight Oil, released in 1978, but you were very, very specific that you didn't want that song, you wanted the 1982 Live at the Capitol Theatre version, because I suspect you were at that concert. And I've watched the video about 100 times trying to see you, but I can't. But tell me why you've chosen it, about the concert and what it means to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, Midnight Oil has been such a massive part of my life. I sort of grew up before I ever since I was sort of a youngster, basically around the inner city. My uncle used to take me along to concerts when I was 12 years old, and we'd go and see all these bands around the city, and he was passionate about Midnight Oil and so on. And I sort of started listening to them, and I connected with the lyrics. It was political, it was angry, it was anti-establishment, it was authentic, it was raw, and just so much about them sort of resonated with me as a young, angry, rebellious teenager, and I just really connected with it from a very early age. And then I had this whole group of mates that I used to go surfing with and stuff, who all were into the oils, and they were all older than me and all had licenses and stuff, and they'd sort of drive me down and help smuggle me into pubs to watch them and all of this sort of thing. So I'd just grown up watching them and being into the oils, and have been all my life. And, many, many, many of my best friends have kind of come on the journey with me. And so, yeah, it was just kind of that whole sort of thing that influenced my life. And it influenced, again, part of my interest in the Indigenous issues came from Midnight Oil. Part of the things that shaped my political views and leanings came from Midnight Oil. And it just had so many different influences in my life. And also when you are young and, feeling you're like trying to find your place in the world and so on, that particular concert was amazing because, first of all, the song itself, you watch that video and you've got to turn it up. It's got to be loud.
Was it the encore?
It was, I think. Yeah, it was. Because I remember the lights came smashing up and they blurted out from backstage with Garrett stumbling across the stage in a frenzy, nearly falling over and so on. But it's just the energy of that version of the song. Like, even if I watch it today or listen to it in my car or whatever on my playlist, it just goes up onto 11 and it makes my hair stand on end. It's just spine tingling.
It's quite different to the album version.
The album version, when you listen to it afterwards, it just sounds so flat, But actually, it was a great song even on the album version, but just the energy that one captures. I think the other part of it was that, the concert itself. So here I am at boarding school. It's a Saturday night, very special family mass and then family dinner. So all the parents come to school. It must have been the end of the sports season or something, but you have these family
And you
masses.
must have been 16 now?
No, that was like 14.
14,
15.
okay, right.
14, 15. 15 would have been, yeah. And so anyway, in those days, you weren't allowed to go out on a Saturday night unless you had, if you were in year 12, but when you're in year 11 or 10, whatever I was then, you weren't allowed out. And not only that, but it was a special family mass and dinner at the school. And so my dear mum knew how much I loved Midnight Oil and wrote a letter that we'd had a death in the family or some tragic kind of thing that was an emergency that I had to get out of school for. So the compromise the school agreed was that I'd go for the mass, but then I'd be allowed to leave to go to the family thing, whatever it was afterwards. Meanwhile, mum's waiting in her car out in the side street of Hunters Hill. Drives me straight to the Capitol Theatre in the city where all my surfer mates were down in the front row. And just as the band came on, I kind of came in. And so I was sort of straight down the front in that mosh pit, this frenzy of sweat and youthful exuberance and energy. And then also my mum and my uncle, who was the one who used to drag me around to all the concerts in the city, loved me not all. They both came in as well. And so they're up the back. The Capitol Theatre has this little bar under the balcony at the very back. Yeah. And they were standing up there having a drink and watching it from a distance. And suddenly my uncle said to my mum, "Alex, that's Andrew up on stage." So at the end of the show, all these kids get up and start dancing on the stage while they're doing their last song. That bit never made it onto end of the film, but it's just such an amazing night. My favourite band, an amazing version, the energy and rawness of it, all my mates and just the story, the Midnight Oil story of my life. It's part of me, yeah.
And something I want to ask you about, which is you are one of the most sort of relentlessly energetic people that I know. And I just want to ask, A, where you get that from, and B, do you just collapse when you get behind doors so no one but Michelle can see you? Or it used to be a nightmare to live with. Or do you get home and then do things all the time? Or do you collapse on the sofa?
Well, I often say that I probably wouldn't have a social life if I wasn't married to Michelle, because when I do come down every day or whatever it is, I love being on my own. I love my own company. I I just spent 2 weeks in hotel quarantine. It was one of my favourite 2 weeks of my life. I loved it. All these people complaining about the food and the lock-in and the whatever. I had no balcony, but it was the beautiful 2 weeks of my life. So I do like my own time to sort of decompress and just, ponder and relax and whatever. I think I am energetic and I just always am on the go. It's just kind of inbuilt in me. But, I think where it comes from is that I've always probably felt like I need to prove myself.
And why is that?
Well, because, I as a youngster, Dad had died and I was, as I said, living with my mum in Glebe and my sister. And here I turn up at this flash private school and I've got long hair and an earring and I'm in fights every day and I'm just the dickhead outsider, right? And everyone else in that school was lovely middle class, white mainly, as am I. But, it was a very kind of different environment. And then my wife's family were very, they were refugees, European, very old-fashioned. And, is this kid from Glebe who always turns up in dirty, ripped clothes good enough for our daughter?
Sure.
And that became an inspiration to me. I think then once I was at school sort of trying to prove, like my grandfather who died when I was about 20, always, Andrew, you're a genius. I don't know where he got that from, but, it seemed at times like he was the only one who ever believed in me. And so I was always really keen to prove him like his judgment was deserved and to prove to my wife's family that, she was in good hands. And I think again, like coming out of high school, I went into UTS to do a law degree, right? And I didn't have the marks for it. They just took me based on an interview. So I didn't really deserve's the wrong word, but I hadn't earned my own space through the traditional HSC mark. So they believed in me and gave me a break. I needed to demonstrate that was a good thing to do. And then, I got my first job with a guy called Rob Coombe, who I'm still very close with, and he supports our work and so on. And he hired me in my first job in the legal thing, and there was all these other candidates who were so much more qualified and smarter, but he just believed in me and saw something. And then I get to Mallison's, which is like the preeminent commercial law firm in Australia back then. It was the establishment firm, and I got in as a paralegal and then they later hired me as a lawyer. Paralegal whilst I was still at uni. I was doing my studies part-time. I just instantly didn't feel like I really belonged here and I was a bit of an imposter. And I guess that's the thing. It's like I've had to fight my way into everything my whole life. And so, even though I've been privileged, there's, it's a horrible word, I know, in some contexts, but I have been privileged. I've been fortunate and I've had doors open for me by people when there was always someone better or more qualified or more blue blood or whatever it was and more connected. And so it's just that sense of fighting for everything, I suppose. It's kind of given me a bit of a burning thing. And the Midnight Oil thing, ignited a fire in me, and that's kind of the flame that they have as well. So I guess it's just that's how I work and that's how I live. And, and then getting to Freshfields, right? Not only like when you're an Aussie living in Hong Kong, you suddenly feel like an Aussie. You never think about it before then, right? You're growing up in Australia, everyone else is Australian, but when you get to London with all the, blue bloods in an establishment Fleet Street law firm in the city, it's all the jokes about kangaroos and convicts and koala bears and all of this sort of stuff. And suddenly it's, it's like, God, now all these young, stuffy, toffee wankers all think they're better than me because of their nationality. And so again, I feel like, God, I'm an outsider again. And so it's just that sort of thing. I don't know.
So this is fascinating. So there's a massive upside to Australia that you've got a chip on your shoulder. It's fantastic. If you didn't have one, you wouldn't.
Is it a chip? Yeah.
or the driving thing. But then I see you knocking around with Gonski and Rudd and Abbott and the cream of commercial and government and the A-list of Australia. And I wonder if you'll ever scratch that itch, or it's just sort of because of it's so long in your life feeling that way that now you've made it in every respect. If your energy levels will dip But or you'll still feel you. I mean, what have you got left to prove?
Oh, it's not proving now. This is just how I am.
Yeah.
I think I'm not trying to prove anything to anyone now. But look, I do find it really tiring, the unrelenting battle, for funding from governments and things like that for what we do when it's so successful and proven and whatever.
Yes.
But, and they profess to want to close the gap, but there's also always reasons not to.
Here's something that works.
Yeah. And it's times you feel like it would be so easy to give up.
Yes.
But like, I don't want to sound, pious or something, but I feel like I would be letting the bastards beat me when I'm here to fight for vulnerable Aboriginal kids who don't have a voice or their families who don't have a voice. And I'm just not going to do that. So, the harder I have to fight, that's fine. That's what I've decided that I'm going to do and I'll keep doing. And, they come and go and then you sort of have a new battle with the next people or whatever. And I don't mean the politicians, it's more the system. It's not the politicians. I've had really great relationships with pretty much every minister and prime minister since 2006 or 7 or so, particularly from Rudd and even slightly before him with John Howard and Joe Hockey, people like that. But, I think it's just the system. The system kind of wears you down and grinds you down. So I won't ever stop that fight. But look, even I just spent the last weekend on a farm, my family's farm that my wife has inherited, and, she's got her sisters there and I'm just out chopping wood and cutting down trees and mowing the lawns and fixing the plumbing and repairing motorbikes and tractors and I just like to do stuff, and sitting around is kind of, to me, I mean, it's fun if I'm sitting around with my great friends and having a few beers by the fire or something like that. That's awesome. But I just like action and I like doing, and doing makes me happy. And, I don't see being happy as a goal in life, but it's a lovely consequence of leading an interesting life, I suppose.
Byron Bay. Is this where your wife's inherited the farm? Or
No.
You've chosen it as your place.
Yeah.
Explain to us why.
Yeah, I mean, it could have easily been the farm, but no, the other farm's at Gloucester. Byron Bay, so as a kid, you've heard about sort of my life growing up as a youngster, and I guess we didn't really have very many family holidays. School holidays are about riding your bike around the streets with your mates and climbing trees or whatever kids, hanging in pinball halls and ice skating rinks and things like that. But I think probably Byron Bay is my first holiday that I can remember as a kid, and I was probably 15 with all my surfer mates who were at the Midnight Oil concert down the front at the Capitol Theatre in 1982. And one of them, his grandparents owned the then disused bakery at Newry Bar, which is now the trendy Harvest Cafe. 25 of us went up in a fleet of cars for like 6 weeks over Christmas one year and spent the summer sleeping on the floor of this concrete floor of a bakery in Newry Bar. And every day we just go surfing and go to the pubs and hang out and have fun and party and so on. And so it just became, that was sort of one of my first experiences, and I fell in love with Byron Bay from that first visit. And then when I left school, me and my 3 best friends, so 4 of us, set out in a little Volkswagen Beetle and an old Valiant, and we headed from Sydney to Noosa. And we stopped at every single beach along the way, stuck up the tent, went surfing, and got to Byron Bay and like, oh my God, this place is just amazing, because I don't think they'd been there or hadn't been there much. And then we continued on our way up to Noosa, got to Noosa at New Year's Eve and actually saw Midnight Oil at Noosa up there play an amazing concert there. And then when we turned around to go back to Sydney and we got to Byron Bay, the other 3 decided we're staying. And they're still there. Yeah.
That's great.
And they're still my 3 best friends. 3 of my best friends. And I was like,
one of them's a national ranger, isn't he?
Yeah, so Sean is the sort of park ranger for Cape Byron National Parks, and Dave is the car park attendant for the Byron Bay Lighthouse, and Darren works for the council in engineering.
So it's a lifelong road trip.
Totally, they're still on it. Yeah, and I was like, no, I'm going to go back to uni. So I went back to uni, and then ended up in London and Hong Kong, and a totally different life. But so even Michelle and I used to go up there when we first started dating in our teens, and then when we had children, we started taking them there every Christmas and summer holidays and so on. We'd bring our family there, and eventually we bought a house there. It's now where we spend every Christmas, and all the family comes, and We don't get up there as much as we'd love to, but it's just a place that's got such a special place in my heart. And, people go, oh, it's changed and all that. It has, but it hasn't. It's still got the same vibe. It's just if you take away all the black four-wheel drives and yuppies, it's kind of still Byron Bay. It's still got the soul. It's similar. And, and I just think all those memories, that those three guys are just the most salt of the earth, genuine, down-to-earth friends I've kind of made in my life. And they just live really amazing, authentic lives. And doesn't matter if I see them once a month or once every 5 years, still your best friends. And so it just kind of, for me, it's an intersection of my young surfer mates from the Midnight Oil days, my schoolmates who I went on the road trip with, my wife, my children, my family, Christmases, holidays, and just the memories, So it is the place, because there's a lot of place where you can develop memories, but there's something special about that place that just really kind of has a special place in my heart.
It's so lovely seeing you, you sort of light up and hearing. And that story about your mates, that is just a classic. So you get free parking.
Yeah. Well, no, free tours of the lighthouse as well, yeah. Go and have a chat to Sean up there next time you're there, folks. And no, but I mean, you can actually, see some really amazing stuff up there. And it's just a beautiful part of the world. And, probably where I'll hang my hat one day or whatever. But, it's just really, as I say, that intersection of friends, life, and everything in my life that's kind of important has all got a
wonderful
kind of something that hovers around Byron Bay.
Red Lycée packet. Now, before you talk about why you've chosen this possession on Five of My Life, I'd like you to describe it for us, but also a little bit about the Chinese traditions about it. It can't have the number 4 in it. You've got to give it with 2 hands, all those things. Because I hadn't heard of a Red Lycée packet before, and obviously I do my research on the things that my guests choose. But just for us, could you explain what one is before you tell us about yours?
Yeah, well, firstly, the number 4 and the 2-hand thing. So that's actually not really anything to do with Lycée packets. They're just other customs in China. So
right, okay.
4 basically in Chinese, say is number 4. It sounds like death.
Right.
And so if you go into any office block or apartment building, it goes level 1, 2, 3, 5.
Is that right?
Yeah, and then 11, 12, 13, 15, and then 21, 22, 23, 25, and so on.
It's their 13, and they take it really seriously.
Much worse than 13.
Right,
13 is a little bit of a joke. It doesn't really mean it. These people take it deadly serious.
How can I have lived to 56 and not known that? That's amazing. Right.
So 4 is a very unlucky number, and it's just not a number that people use and name things after, or buildings or offices or street building or whatever it is. Even a lot of people won't have a 4 on their number plate, and they'll replace it and so on. So that's, you wouldn't put $4 in a Lycée packet, but you wouldn't
put it anywhere
4
else.
Is just generally, 8 is awesome. 8 is really good luck, get fat, be rich, whatever, be prosperous, healthy, happy. It's a great number, 8. And the 2-handed thing. So it's Lycée packets. You always hand it to someone with 2 hands, but you also do that with name cards.
Right.
So, and money in a bank or in a shop, when you get your change, they'll always hand it to you in 2 hands, and you take it with 2 hands. So that's just part of a Chinese culture. So the Lycée packet is a little red envelope, golden Chinese characters written in it that say nice things in Chinese, like be prosperous or rich or healthy or happy or whatever, just good luck messages for Chinese New Year. And at Chinese New Year, the custom is that you give them to everyone. So generally sort of the senior people give them to the junior, and, Hong Kong is a little bit of a Chinese culture's got lots of hierarchical kind of aspects to it. And so, the secretary doesn't give it to the CEO, but the CEO gives it to the secretary, and
Understood.
the tenant gives it to the doorman, and so on. But at Chinese Year, everyone gives them to everybody. And so I've arrived in Hong Kong in January 1995, just after getting married. And the first Chinese Year is normally, February or something like that, early in the year. It changes. But one of my colleagues at work, a secretary in this law firm I was working with, Freshfields in Hong Kong again, handed me this, and I didn't know anything about it. And so it's just to me, I guess, so it's something that everyone gives everyone at Chinese New Year as a gesture of good luck, like a Christmas present or whatever. And the money inside is not, the currency is not important. The amount is not important. If you're giving one to your secretary, it probably matters a little bit more. But and And also it's got to have fresh notes. You can't have crumpled, old, dirty up, screwed up notes and whatever.
Okay.
So you always get clean banknotes from the Bank of China Museum. So look, I think it was given to me by, my first secretary in Hong Kong. I loved the gesture of it and my first exposure and welcoming to Hong Kong culture and that sort of thing. I've just grown over my life to love China, Chinese culture, Hong Kong in particular, so many aspects of it. And I've just kind of kept it with me, and it's travelled with me at every desk, every office, everywhere I've ever worked. It sits in my top drawer.
And you've never opened it?
Well, I've opened it to see what was inside it when I first got it.
Yeah.
And now it's just got a little $2 coin in it. And it's just my memento of, the time I had in Hong Kong. And it's always kind of accompanied with a little photo, which is me with a whole lot of my mates that I played rugby with at a lunch with John Eales and Mark Eller and Glenn Eller, and just before the Rugby Sevens one year, and a lot of those guys then died in Bali shortly after. So it's kind of the two things sort of sit side by side in my drawer wherever I work, and it's my way of remembering and thinking about one of my favourite places in the world and one of the favourite parts of my life, and the Chinese culture and what that means to me, and I, look, I'm not superstitious. Very cynical about things like this, but there's just something about the seriousness that when Chinese people talk about their superstitions and their cultural things and whatever, it's not like, the zodiac signs or something like that, which kind of make my eyes roll. But these are about things that have just carried for centuries in their culture and the longevity of these little gestures and so on. And so, and then, again, Hong Kong was a place that had an amazing, amazing part of my life, amazing friends, but also tragedy. I lost all my mates in the Bali bombings again. And so it's my little thing that I just kind of remember that as well. And it makes me think about them and their lives and their wives and their children they left behind and those sorts of things. So it's a inconsequential in terms of monetary value or preciousness or anything, but it's just something that means a lot to me. And when I was thinking about the possession, I like, well, what's one thing that I've kind of had forever, and I've lived all over the world and spent a lot of my life in different countries, but it's the one thing that's kind of been with me for the last 30 years. And no matter where I go or what I do, it's kind of there.
So for me, it's a beautiful choice, and it's a very good example of what 5 of My Life tries to be about. It makes you think about what you might choose, and I wouldn't have heard that story if you hadn't chosen it. I think it's a privilege to listen to you, mate. It's just lovely to hear your stories. Now we're going to come on to my 6th question. That's one of my favourite parts of this podcast, because guests tell me their choices in advance. They don't tell me why, but they tell me their choices, so I go off and do as much research as I can on them. But they don't tell me the answer to the 6th question. They tell me that live. So I'm going to ask you, who would you like to hear on 5 of My Life next, and why?
Well, I think it's really obvious. I'd love to hear Nigel Marsh.
No, you can't.
And I know the perfect person who could interview. No, I mean, I think it would be fascinating. But look, I think when I was thinking about really interesting people that I've come across in my life, I mean, I would love to hear Nigel Marsh, by the way. But when I think about really interesting people, Nicholas Rothwell, who introduced me through his book to this Atlas of the Heavens, he is one of the most softly gentle-spoken and articulate communicators that I've ever met in my life. And every word and sentence he utters is thoughtful and interesting and just fascinating. He's a fascinating man. And he used to write frequently in The Australian covering Aboriginal affairs, and he's married to an Aboriginal lady. He lives up in the mountains in Queensland, up behind Cairns somewhere in the rainforest, in a very humble and quiet life up there. But he's and when he wrote in The Australian Aboriginal Affairs, he probably one of the most, if not the most, kind of insightful, knowledgeable writers on Indigenous affairs and Aboriginal affairs in Australia, with a poetic turn of phrase and just a fascinating guy. And yeah, I think it'd be really interesting for people to hear his voice and hear his stories if he were willing to do it.
What a wonderful, wonderful recommendation. I have adored listening to you talk about your 5 choices, Andrew. It's just been fabulous for me. I am going to take away many things from this, but the notion that life hangs on a thread, and the story about your mates and the accident with Stu, it's just been a very meaningful and beautiful conversation. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Nigel.
The 5 of My Life was presented by me, Nigel Marsh. Producer, Alex Mitchell. Sound production and theme music by Darcy Thompson and Matt Nicholish.